introduction. Very much appreciated. And I'll go ahead and share my screen here next, if I may.
Absolutely.
Great. Okay. Well, good evening, everyone. And thank you again for the generous introduction and the chance to be able to speak here tonight. Bring this on up here for it to come full screen. And as Rachel said, longtime social studies teacher, been working with the 34th here in a few different capacities. It's a real pleasure to be here tonight with all of you. Tonight, I do want to provide the opportunity for us to learn about climate policies 101, and a chance to be able to dig in there with some exemplars and the like that come from locally as well as the state level and even the national level, as there was news about that a little bit here this past weekend. And I first want to address kind of the elephant in the room whenever you talk about climate, and that is often this question about, should we be hopeful or should we all be doom scrolling, which is so much of what I suppose we do with the news these days. And just to kind of frame that in a visual, courtesy of Grist magazine, this one resonated with me about the kind of dichotomy that exists so much with that. As a social studies teacher, as Rachel mentioned, oftentimes as I introduce this topic to my students in a variety of different units, the first thing they ask, and I'll use perhaps less colorful language than what they do, is how screwed are we? And the challenge then becomes that you're almost serving as grief counselor for the future with students. And what I want to provide here tonight is not ignorance in terms of ignoring that, but the opportunity for us to at least provide somewhat more of a balanced perspective. Because as much as there is plenty to consider for doom, there are also these things for us to consider for hope. And in my opinion, hope is an important motivator for people to consider and grasp a better future. So let's consider the doom part just for a moment, and we're all familiar with the headlines. Hopefully these are coming up successfully. Hurricane Ida, of course, hitting Louisiana there on the anniversary of Hurricane Katrina a decade and a half ago. Considering fires in Australia and other parts of the world that have been extraordinarily damaging in the last couple of years related to climate change, as we know it to be more and more so. Flooding in places like Indonesia and Jakarta, the damage that has done in different events here in the last couple of years. In our own backyard here, the hottest June on record for the contiguous United States, and heat waves that were lethal here in our part of the country this past summer, and of course the fires that followed with that. The trends in terms of data showing the 20th century average for summer temperatures, June temperatures, that's clearly going the wrong direction. There's plenty of doom here to consider. Brazil's Amazon rainforest. Yeah.
I'm sorry. Are your slides progressing? I think we're not seeing where we should be in your presentation.
Got it. Very possible. I'll try to see if we can make the correction on that here. So let me jump back out and I'll try a different way. If it's still sitting there on the main screen, I apologize. Is it moving now? Slide now with the different headlines popping up?
Yes, you're good now. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Well, as I was saying, there's plenty in terms of the doom piece for us to consider. Climate change is an increasing threat to Africa. And of course, the fears of the what's happening in the Antarctic, the Doomsday Glacier, which has doom in the title, for goodness sake. And so we have to acknowledge these. We can't be ignorant of them. But we also have to understand that there's room for hope and to provide that perspective. Otherwise, especially for our youngest voters, that they become paralyzed by fear. And so if we consider that in something that's more hopeful, we have to consider perhaps history, which is what I've spent a lot of time with teaching over the years. And one of the best places to start with a climate of hope here has to do with some of our policy accomplishments over the last really half century. For many of us here in the room, we can remember 1970. It was just a touch before my time, but certainly the evidence suggests that back in America in 1970, we lived in cities that dealt with particulate matter that was beyond toxic, well beyond what the World Health Organization recommends as 10 parts or 10 micrograms per cubic meter. Look at Los Angeles on the map there that's in front of you with 107 micrograms per cubic meter, San Francisco at 53, Seattle at 65, Philadelphia at 122, Phoenix at 217. I mean, the reality was America in 1970 was choking on air pollution. The resolution of that became the famous Clean Air Act of 1970, and then, of course, the subsequent updates that have brought us to a country now that has dramatically cleaner air. Look at the comparison. Hopefully you can see that well in the chart that compares the United States and some of our cities to cities in China. And although we do have a ways to go to get below 10 micrograms per cubic meter, consider the comparison. I mean, Los Angeles today at 15.3 versus 107. There's no comparison. It's night and day. And this is the result of good policy. This is a result of what we can do through legislation at the federal level and locally too, to be able to improve environmental circumstances here in the United States. Another one that's less known perhaps is the Sunshot Initiative, which is really just something that resulted in the last 10 years or so. If you roll back to 2010, when we consider our sources of energy and whether they're cost competitive or not, it's pretty obvious by the chart here and what you may recall that in 2010, solar PV and solar energy generally for the levelized cost of electricity in terms of kilowatt hours, cents per kilowatt hour, was simply not competitive. At 52 cents for residential installed solar PV versus 40 cents for commercial versus 28 cents. I mean, you're talking about prices that are several times what you would get for electricity generated from fossil fuels, especially coal at that point. Well, the goal of the Sunshot Initiative, and some luck, I suppose, with other innovations that are coming along too, was to drive down the price of electricity from this most plentiful renewable resource in terms of solar. And the result of that, through policy, through leadership, and a confluence of different events, is that we succeeded in doing so. By 2017, we dropped that cost for residential down to 16 cents per kilowatt hour. Our goal for 2020 was to get to 10 cents. We didn't quite get to that. We got to 13 cents for residential, but still the progress is obvious. For commercial in 2010, from 40 cents per kilowatt hour, driven down all the way to 11 cents per kilowatt hour by 2017. By 2020, we hadn't quite achieved that goal of 8 cents. We were just right about 10 cents for it, but it's obvious that we were making tremendous progress with it. And look at utility, where we had our greatest success from 28 cents per kilowatt hour down to 6 cents per kilowatt hour 3 years in advance of the 2020 goal. Now, if you'll note the goals for 2030, those are ambitious at an even greater level, I think. In fact, the Biden administration has just revised it so that it's for utility to get down to 3 cents per kilowatt hour for the cost, including storage. That is, with batteries and other ways to be able to hold that electricity when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. So it's ambitious, but it also shows that with good policy, we should be hopeful. We have had success. All the estimates of what the price of solar PV was going to get to in this decade were way off. We've done dramatically better. And we're seeing nonlinear growth in terms of the installation of solar and massive drops in terms of cost for it. And maybe the best success for a climate of hope has to do with the only United Nations environmental treaty that's been ratified by every country on the planet. That is the famous Montreal Protocol. I remember back in elementary school where we had the great fears about what was happening with the ozone layer back in the 1980s for me. And it was obvious to anybody who dared follow the science that we were doing tremendous damage, not just to the planet and the protective ozone layer, but to our own skin and our health. And ultimately, the Montreal Protocol, which is again ratified by every country in the world in 1987, has allowed us to replace chlorofluorocarbons in our refrigerants and yes, even in our hairspray with products that are more safe for the ozone. And ultimately, what we're seeing now by 2020, 2021 is we're trending in the right direction for the stability of the ozone layer. And it's projected by mid-century, we will have solved the problem. And by solving that problem, it's not just for the environment alone, it has had an impact on our very health as well. The estimate is that we have saved the lives of 2 million people per year on the planet through the Montreal Protocol in terms of prevention of death through skin cancer. So think about this. As much as we consider doom, and we have to understand the risk that is there, it is huge, it is proximate, it is something we must understand and appreciate. We also have to understand this reality that there is hope. There are opportunities for us to do things with good policy. So how do we differentiate good from bad climate policy? Well, let's dig into that a little bit here. And I'm going to lean heavily on my favorite climate journalist, David Roberts. When we think about what makes good climate policy, at the basic sense, good policy addresses the issue head on. It doesn't settle for peripheral solutions. And to borrow from Roberts again, clean electrification is the entree. And really everything else is just a side. And if you think about this in even simpler language, as once on the screen there, perhaps, that Robert suggests that we need to do two things. We have to electrify everything, and then we have to green the grid. And as we do that, we're going to see tremendous improvements. So good climate policy does those things. And think about this as far as visualizing what we're looking at for CO2 emissions. This comes from the mayor's office in New York City. Imagine, if you will, a ton of carbon dioxide as a sphere that would be about 10 meters across. Well, a single day of emissions in New York City would basically bury the Empire State Building in those spheres. A year's worth of emissions in New York City would bury most of the city in a gigantic mountain of those. So as we try to consider what's good climate policy, we have to address the bulk of this. We can't just settle for peripheral issues. We can't just settle for the appetizers. We need the entree. We need the main dish here for us to be able to see progress. What makes good climate policy? Well, globally, to borrow from Bill Gates in his recent book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster, we need to think of two numbers. The first number is 51 billion, which is 51 billion tons of greenhouse gases that we pump into the atmosphere every single year as a planet. And we need to think of zero, which is where we need to get by the middle of the century, or sooner if we can. So this will be challenging. And as we kind of scale that back from a global level, the United States alone has emissions in 2019 that exceed 6.5 billion tons of greenhouse gases. Washington State with approximately 99 million tons based on EPA estimates for that same year. For comparison, Canadian emissions, 730 million tons in 2019. For British Columbia, approximately 62 million tons based on their government estimate. And if you look at the pie chart here for globally, think about where these come from. 31% from making things, including steel, cement, plastics, etc. It's the other pieces there as far as the wedges of the pie. 16% globally for transportation. Although, as Gates notes, transportation in the United States is the biggest single wedge of the pie because, well, we fly and drive a lot. So good climate policy addresses these things head on and allows us to consider the entree that's going to provide the main dish for this and solving it as opposed to peripheral issues. So if we dig into this next, and I know I'm talking fast, but let's consider as well what makes bad climate policy. There's the first part, which I hope is obvious to everybody in the room. Bad policy either denies the existence of climate change, and certainly we all know deniers. We live with them. They're a percentage of the country. I don't want to give them too much of my time and breath here simply because we have to go by the science. We have to go with the evidence tells us clearly and what the consensus of the scientific community is, that we are facing a climate crisis as opposed to there isn't one. So let's put that to the side for now. But we also have to consider those who are suggesting that, well, let's take action, but it's going to be these peripheral pieces. And that runs us into a little bit of the challenge of greenwashing, which has defined disinformation disseminated by an organization so as to present an environmentally responsible public image. We know that exists in different areas. It even exists in some of the policy proposals that are out there right now at different levels of government. Which policies lead to curbing the majority of global emissions by 2030 and which don't is probably the simplest way to frame things here for the question. And if you want to start considering a little bit how to play around with this a little bit yourself and come to this distinction between good versus bad climate policy, let me put something in the chat here if I can for a moment. What you're seeing on screen there is a chart. I'll link that for you so you can look at it on your own. A chart that comes from MIT Sloan School of Business. It's called En-ROADS. This is their powerful software based on UN data that allows you to make the decisions about what's good policy and what is not. It's a fascinating one that is very deep, very complex, but the interface is simple. Move the sliders, see the bar change, see what happens as you go through that. It's a great one to play with. It's one I use with my students now. It just came out a year ago, and it's a good one for us to start thinking about, hey, what solutions can we have? And you'll find real quick, you can electrify buildings and industry, you can get rid of coal, you can do those things. And what you'll find is that only then you're starting to make a dent in the problem. It takes big actions. It takes the entrees, not the appetizers. So feel free to play around with that one a little bit in the background. I won't be insulted if you're off task here because really you're on task. You're finding solutions for yourself. Okay, so let's get to the policy part. And I'm framing this as local, regional, and national. There's a little international that we'll get to as time permits for it there, but there's the obvious topic about what's happening in Glasgow right now, but we'll save that till the end. If we go really local, and we'll go to Bellevue, Washington, because that's where I teach And some of our work that we've been doing as a school, as I've been kind of leading some of the climate work for that, has been to connect with the city of Bellevue and allow for students not only to see their environmental stewardship plan they have in Bellevue, but also to provide feedback to city council members, staff, to learn more about it and to be able to interact with it. One component of their environmental stewardship plan talks about greenhouse gas emissions, climate change, and the like. And you can see some of the key strategies they have. To boil it down, when we look at the city of Bellevue's plan, we understand the ambition they have, but we also understand the limits they face, most likely because of lack of resources. They are claiming a 26% reduction in community-wide greenhouse gas emissions despite 20% population growth. And we know that Puget Sound, Western Washington, the state as a whole, and the region, we're facing population growth. So not only do we have to drive down our greenhouse gases, we have to do so even despite the fact that we're continuing to grow by population. That's hard. It's very hard to do. Now, Bellevue is claiming that reduction, but note a big chunk of it comes in 2020, which was COVID year. And so some of that drop is probably going to be more than made up in 2021. We don't have that data yet, but we'll see it soon, and we'll find out if they're able to sustain that lower rate to continue with it or not. So for communities like Bellevue and others, we need strong policy. And I think the environmental stewardship plan is ambitious. It's visionary in many ways for their community, but in terms of greenhouse gases, we're simply going to have more if we're going to meet the goals that we have to have. There's no way around that. Let's jump to the county level. We'll go one level higher with that. And we can consider the Strategic Climate Action Plan, certainly one for us to consider with it. And SCAP is a living document that's updated every 5 years, been around for better than a decade now. The 2015 SCAP accomplishments include some very notable things. First off, that it launched the Frontline Community Climate Partnerships to support climate literacy and also developments in communities of color. So when you get to that equity focus, the one thing we cannot do is balance and solve climate change on the backs of the poor and our most frontline communities that are disproportionately Black and brown. So when we think about that, we have to understand the challenge that's there and applaud King County for being willing to engage in that equity work. Since 2010, King County claims they've stabilized greenhouse gas emissions and led to an 11% per capita reduction. Important and noteworthy, especially while King County, like Bellevue, has of course been growing, but we need to go further. We need more resources to do that. And think as well that planting 1 million trees in King County, along with creating a certified carbon credit program to protect local forests, is definitely worthy of applause. The challenge, as we know now from the best science, is that those new planted forests, those new trees, well, they need good care. They need to be looked after until they can sustain themselves, which is several years away, even in our region. And for them to become net sinks of carbon as opposed to net sources of carbon, we have to get them mature. That takes time and it takes forward vision with it. And King County needs to make sure that those 1 million trees are able to survive into adulthood and become great sequestering of carbon for it. So I'm sure, I don't want to speak for county officials here on this, but I have no doubt that more resources would be useful in terms of helping them with the work they're trying to do. To the state level, and there's a number of things we can talk about at the state level, because I think Washington State is truly an exemplar of everything I've been able to study. David Roberts recommends that this is a state that has basically the whole suite of climate policies after the work of the last 3 or 4 legislative sessions. And maybe the crown jewel, at least for that now, is the Washington Climate Commitment Act that just passed earlier this year. And this was so important that Governor Inslee was willing to wield his line item veto to break the linkage that was in the original bill, to break that apart from the transportation package that wasn't yet implemented, and then to speed implementation of this. We'll see where that goes based on lawsuits and the like that have been threatened against the governor for it. But at the very least, it shows the priority of this. And consider what this does. You're implementing a cap and invest program that limits carbon emissions statewide, beginning in January 2023 and expanding over 8 years to cover 80+% of greenhouse gas emissions in the state, which is truly ambitious. Now, the rulemaking has to come from the Department of Ecology. There's still pieces that we're waiting to see how those are played out yet as far as what the price on carbon is going to be and the like. But when you consider this piece of legislation doesn't have to be reauthorized, it has no sunset provision. Unlike things at the federal level that will perhaps come with a reconciliation bill, this stays in place and continues to do its work until the work is done. And hopefully we get done with that work well before 2050. There's the possibility of linking to California to make one big carbon market. We'll see if that's desirable, because ultimately that may water down the price of carbon a little bit. But at the very least, Washington State has taken, if not the pole position of the country by state level, one of the leading positions in this work and work with our clean energy standard a couple of years ago, and all the other work that goes along with this low carbon fuel standard, which I know Representative Fitzgibbon has worked hard to make happen. Those are all major pieces that provide us a wraparound suite of really entree-worthy items for our state. Now, the big news, and I was actually in Washington, D.C. this past week. I'll claim no credit for what happened with the infrastructure bill, nor blame. I was just a tourist, but had the opportunity to be there as this piece was being negotiated. Well, now, ultimately, when we think of the infrastructure bill, we're talking about a $1.2 trillion bill, not all of which deals with climate, and some of which, when you're talking about more roads and more bridges and the like, works against climate. But we have to understand the pieces that are there that are at least worthy of consideration as what I would call perhaps appetizing level. $150 billion for clean energy advancement is a little bit of a nebulous term, but we're still talking about moving towards cleaner sources of electricity. $73 billion for modernizing the US electricity grid is important. It doesn't solve all the problems. You're talking about something that would take more than $1 trillion probably to do that, but you're at least making a down payment on work that has to happen just to make us be able to withstand some of the climate-related disasters that we're going to be facing in the future. $15 billion for low emissions buses and ferries, as well as plug-in electric vehicle chargers, is an important down payment. Doesn't provide us with the 500,000 electric vehicle chargers that President Biden promised, but it's a start. So we're looking at pieces of the puzzle, small pieces that are coming forward with us. And for Washington State, the Seattle Times just talked about this, that Sound Transit refers to the $8.6 billion we're going to be receiving in dedicated funding from this infrastructure bill as potentially a game changer for public transit. We will see. It's going to take time. This won't be overnight. That's not how infrastructure works. But ultimately, that with billions more to come in grants, we'll see the effect here in Washington State. That will make it easier and a little cheaper for us as state residents to enjoy perhaps expansion to the next levels of Sound Transit. For those of us in West Seattle over the next decade, hoping to get a link in from light rail, this money makes that more possible, which takes cars off the road, which obviously, hopefully, improves our carbon shadow or carbon footprint if you prefer. So something to think about there. But the entree for the federal level, and what, according to Senator Joe Manchin anyway, won't happen, is the clean energy payment or clean energy performance program that has been proposed. And I suppose we're dreaming a little bit even to bring it up now because it seems unlikely it'll be included. But this is something when we think at the national level that gets out to that entree and the promise of it. Consider in 2020 that 40% of our electricity is generated from clean sources. That does include things like nuclear, so you can define clean as you will, but it also includes a big hefty share of renewables. Well, by 2030, with a clean energy payment program based on the NRDC modeling that we're seeing here, you get to 80%. That's massive growth over 9 years, which does quite a lot. In terms of CO2 emissions compared to where we were in 2005, you're seeing a reduction with this policy in place, if it would happen, by 86%. And we're talking about a massive impact on our CO2 emissions. For sulfur dioxide, SO2 emissions, which have all sorts of environmental consequences, including health, you're talking about a 93%. For nitrous oxide, which is a greenhouse gas potent in its own right, you're talking about a 76% reduction. Do these solve everything we need by 2050? No, but you're talking about a massive impact that this policy could have. And I think that, to call out members of the Democratic Party is probably not a good idea, especially at a forum here, but we need Senator Joe Manchin and others who have been, I won't even say reluctant to consider this, refusing to consider this. We need them to change their tune. It's a need situation. And that's my opinion. I'll own it, but it's definitely one that the facts seem to bear it out. So how do we get involved? And this is where the call to action comes. And I think that first off, probably many of us in the room are no strangers to calling Congress. Sarah Smith, who runs a methane task force that was interviewed on, again, David Roberts' podcast, talked about how we need to think about calling Congress and taking political action, sort of like many Americans think about going to church. You don't go to church every Sunday to solve all of your problems in one sitting. You're doing this as a habit. You're doing this as something that's frequent. And I thought that was a great metaphor for what we need to do with Congress. We don't expect one phone call or one email or one letter to solve all of our problems. We need to get, not just individually, but collectively in the habit of doing this on a frequent, ideally weekly basis when Congress is in session. Think about what that would do. We can't fall into the old trap of doing nothing and being fresh out of ideas. we need to engage. And this is an opportunity this month, here in November, maybe more so than any other time on this issue, to be able to push for better federal policy. So consider that link that's there, reaching out to Congress and the like. I'll drop it in the chat here in a moment once we wrap up. I think the state level is equally as important. Though we've done a great deal in Washington State, there's still more that we can do. How are we going to decarbonize privately owned buildings? That's something that we have indirect policies on now, but there's still massive work that needs to be done there. So think about reaching out to your legislative leaders here in Washington State and the 34th. Yes, of course, we have great leadership there, but also beyond that to push for more reluctant members to get more aggressive policy in it. And then finally at the local level. And this one has a little bit of a personal appeal because as a public school teacher, obviously I pay attention to what's happening in our schools. School districts are big institutions with big carbon footprints, right? And in Seattle or King County or the city of Seattle and the like, we have to understand that we have perhaps outsized voices there at the local level. I tell my students and my sons all the time that they have a superpower that those of us with gray hair now no longer quite possess, which is that fresh, earnest face that can make elected officials just eat their heart out, right? And so I wanted to share with you here tonight, and hopefully the audio works, I think I've got it set for it, a moment in time back in August, just a couple months ago, when the Seattle School District had the opportunity, their first in-person meeting in quite some time, to invite public commentary on their upcoming levy in February 2022. Now, my son Spencer, near and dear to my heart, of course, so I have great pride in, took this opportunity actually to address the school board. And we talked about it a little bit. I showed him the opportunity. He said he wanted to do it. We talked a bit about, hey, you know, maybe I can help you with the script, very dad moment. And he said, you know, when I build my YouTube videos, which says every 12-year-old ever, I don't really use a script. I kind of freestyle it. So I gave him a couple bullet points, and I think you can see the result of that in what I'm about to share. It's brief, it's halting, but think about how a 12-year-old getting up in front of elected officials maybe can inspire you to take action as well. Let's hear from Spencer.
I'm here to talk about the February 2022 Clean Energy Levy. Why should we do this? It can let our students live longer and fuller lives. And we can set an example for our state. How can we do this? We can, in buildings that are being remodeled, add electric heat pumps and electric stovetops. And replace aging and broken natural gas heating and cooking with newer electric ones. Thank you. I yield the remainder of my time.
So there's Spencer, who's always been a brave kid, to say the least. And certainly a proud parent moment that I'm happy to share here with the audience. But think too, again, a 12-year-old being willing to step up there and to tell his local officials what his interest is. And for him, for my students, for my son Theo as well, for every young person, their vested stake in this is greater than ours. It simply is. They're going to have to live with this longer in terms of the consequences of climate change and what we'll see. So I hope that is something that inspires you to take action as well. I'm happy to be of help with that, as you know. Lastly, conclusion, looking ahead. When we think about what's happening right now in Glasgow, we have to understand that it is consequential, the world and what it's attempting to do. We know they're trying to build based on what happened in Paris just 6 years ago now, with 30,000 delegates representing 197 nations that are expected to attend, that are attending now. We could consider ultimately what shows us to be success or not. And there's three ingredients that we can consider for it. What happens in the year before COP26 to advance climate ambition, this conference of partners that's going on right now. How successful the official negotiations are at the Conference of Partners right now, which shows some prospects in terms of methane reduction globally, which shows some prospects in terms of financing for countries that can't afford to make changes in terms of their economies for it. We're seeing progress, little bits, but also especially, and maybe most importantly, what progressive coalitions and alliances emerge for action on climate change to implement the Paris Agreement and beyond successfully. That's where we come in, because ultimately we're the constituents. We're the ones that will get the real action to happen at the national, at the state, and at the local level. That's what has to happen. no conference of partners can be successful without the public behind them doing the work to make that action happen. Otherwise, well, we'll just have promises and we won't have action. We need action. We need that at this time, and I know I can count on all of you to help deliver it. Thank you. It's been my pleasure to present here tonight. I'll yield the remainder of my time to the vice chair and the chair for any questions they care to deliver. It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Randy, very much. That was a fabulous program. We have some questions for you, and let me just go through. Here we go. So our first question is, what do you think of the proposed nuclear energy plant on the Hanford site using water from the Columbia? And this is by way of the Seattle Times article.
Right. It's a great question, and it's one that we're just starting to see some of that tonight. You know, there's a Seattle Times article on it. There's another one I was looking at just yesterday on that. You know, you hear the maybe siren call for new nuclear every once in a while, and I do think that when it comes down to it, if Bill Gates' promise with some of his wave reactors and the like can reduce what we have in terms of nuclear waste stockpiles that's piled up in Paducah, Kentucky for the moment, if it can do that, well, that's promising. But the reality is we don't have much evidence that it actually can. So I think we need to be careful when we talk about new nuclear. We need to subject it to rigorous science. We need to subject it to rigorous policy. And ultimately, we have to ask the hard question that, look, if we're really seeing the decline in cost for solar PV, and if batteries are going to be next, the whole point of having nuclear is to replace that base load that can fire up and produce a lot of electricity, rain, shine, no sun, whatever. Well, if we can store electricity beyond just a couple hours that we can right now with lithium batteries, and pay attention to what's happening with some of the iron air batteries and some of the technological breakthroughs that will be coming in the next couple of years, then maybe you don't need nuclear or as much of it, or maybe you don't need to bother with that. I think there's promise in what's out there as far as energy storage, which is the whole point of it anyway. So I would look at nuclear with a pretty heavily skeptical eye for it.
Thank you. And another question for you. How can we reduce LNG and coal used in a large part of our state via Puget Sound Energy? And how does PSE compare to others like City Light, Tacoma PUD, and other county utility districts? Our questioner here does not believe that LNG is clean energy.
Sure, and I'd agree with the questioner. I don't think it is either, to be really blunt. When we talk about liquefied natural gas, I mean, the burning of it in your appliance, whether that's in your stove or the like, yeah, it's obviously cleaner than coal in that point, in terms of point of use. But the extraction of it with the methane that it releases makes it at least as bad as coal in terms of it and the total life cycle of it. So I'm highly skeptical of liquefied natural gas as well. I think it's dangerous, and I think it's problematic in every sense of the word. How do we get rid of it, and how does PSE compare? We had the opportunity with the EELU for Energy and Environment, Energy, and Land Use Caucus to hear from both Seattle City Light representatives and Puget Sound Energy. And I was greatly impressed by Seattle City Light with not only how forthright they are, but that their track record is so strong. With Puget Sound Energy, I asked the question bluntly, why should we trust you based on your track record? And, you know, I give credit to them for being willing to answer that we're trying to do new things that are going to meet the demands for renewable electricity. So I think ultimately it comes down to how do we make the change? I think it's going to require the push. I think it's going to require the push from ratepayers that are demanding that are signing up, yes, with PSE for some of their green energy programs to make it clear that we want our dollar to go there, not to what has been tried and not terribly true to the environment. So I think we need to make choices as consumers, and I think we need to continue to push our elected officials and our utilities.
Great. Another question for you. How do we pop the greenwashing bubble called net zero with quotes?
Yeah, it's a great point because ultimately, you know, if net zero exists to put us in a world where offsets that are unverified, as we've heard in California at times with their carbon program for it, then I think that's a risky place. Where are we really doing anything through the offsets? Because we at very least need strongly verified programs that have independent third-party verification to say this money you're putting towards an offset is actually doing what you want it to do. And that's difficult, right? I think with the world of net zero, part of me comes back to the technological solution, and maybe at another time I can delve into a chance for us to learn more about what's happening in the tech sector right now that is showing us how you're really entering nonlinear growth that could push us to some pretty phenomenal outcomes in terms of emissions reduction by the middle of the next decade. I don't want to get ahead of myself too much because that's a pretty fantastical claim, but I think ultimately what's going to pop the net zero bubble is our ability to reduce, and also technology's ability to reduce emissions and to transform things. It becomes more a pattern of disruption. And when we think about, I'll show you my cell phone, right? Remember what this thing was 40 years ago? It was a brick. Remember how we bought Kodak cameras? Nobody does anymore. And when you think about technologies that suddenly become obsolete, think about the picture, the famous one from New York City in 1908, which perhaps I'll try to dig up for a future occasion, that shows one car surrounded by 1,000 horses. 10 years later, it's 1,000 cars with one horse in the picture. We're living through disruptive change, and I think technology plays a major part in that. But ultimately, it's going to require a conscientious effort on our part to say that, look, you don't get to cheat with the offsets. They need to be genuine. They need to be something that we can trust and verify through credible means. And that's going to require our willingness to advocate.
Okay, so another question, Randy. What are the greatest sources of carbon emissions locally, and what do you think needs to happen in order to lower those emissions?
Sure. We can certainly think of down in Centralia with the coal-fired generation of electricity plant that's there that's just going to be going offline in the next 5 years. That's one of the big ones. But I think ultimately in Washington State, it's about transportation. So every person that has a tailpipe on their car, I'm lucky that I was able to shop in the bargain basement bin for used electric vehicles twice in the last 5 years, and I've got 2 electric cars. And far from extending the tailpipe in our state, I'm using hydropower and I'm using the solar PV that's right above me to be able to charge my car, which is great. So I think we need to kind of look in the mirror and understand that transportation is our biggest point of pollution with that in terms of carbon emissions. Now, one promising thing, back to technology for a second, we have to understand that we're living in a revolution down here in terms of energy and our source of electricity that's underway right now, but we're also going to be living under a revolution in terms of transparency. You have a constellation of 400 plus privately owned satellites that are going to be monitoring different sources of methane and environmental pollution throughout the world. Those are coming online right now. And the goal that we're hearing from different organizations is they want that to be public information so they can point the finger and say, it's there, that methane source, that coal-fired plant, those things, so people will know where it is, what it is. I don't have all the answers right now, but I think over the next 5 years, as we get more information that's more public, more democratic as a result, we'll be able to arm ourselves and go to our utilities, to go to our elected officials and say, it's not that we just want to reduce pollution or carbon emissions, we want it gone in those places. We can demand that when we have that information to say, those are the big polluters, make it happen.
Another question, waste production was greatly minimized in the articles. Is that not the end point in nuclear energy? And where does the waste go?
Yeah, it's a great point. And again, I'm most familiar with Bill Gates' WAVE reactor that talks about reducing stockpiles of waste energy from the generation of nuclear that's kind of Gen 2, the 1970s, and then some of the Gen 1, 1950 stuff. Again, it's stockpiled, it's sitting there, it's an environmental problem. But ultimately, yeah, we have to identify the waste stream. Unless we're willing to tuck it underground for several thousand years, which obviously is beyond toxic, and how it leaches out into groundwater and how long we'd have to maintain that. That's why I'm so skeptical about nuclear. And I think in the articles, yeah, they are minimizing something that we have to ask the hard questions on, definitely.
Randy, why are there 500 delegates from the oil extraction industries? And are there members of non-governmental environmental groups?
I presume that you're referring to what's happening in Glasgow at COP26.
I don't have that in the question, but
Okay.
I'm assuming
Sure.
maybe. Certainly lobbyists and special interests and where the oil industry people are.
I see a yes that just popped up, so let's assume that's the case. And one of the lessons that we do in my class actually gave me a chance to answer that very one, because my students engage between multiple schools in a climate simulation where they negotiate an international agreement, sort of like what COP is doing right now. And some of the roles that we have are obviously different regions and countries of the world, but we also have the NGOs and we have the fossil fuel lobby that's there too. They're there because they have a vested stake. Their goal is basically to slow down progress. They're trying to protect their bottom line. And, you know, there are some actors that you're starting to see in the fossil fuel industry. It's not quite as monolithic as you might believe, but ultimately for them, the best scenario is a slow transition, one that takes decades to accomplish. But we know that we don't have decades to accomplish that transition. We have years in probably the single digit sense. So they're there for their vested interest. And ultimately, that's something that you permit, I suppose, in these open kind of conferences. But you do have, for every one of them that's there, what's been getting the headlines in the last week, which is really encouraging, is you're hearing the voices of kids. You're hearing the voices of the advocates. Greta obviously gets the headlines for it, but there are a host of others that are being interviewed, that are talking about it. Their voice is what we're hearing in the media, not so much the usual fossil fuel dissemination of really misleading information for it. So to me, that's encouraging. But yes, they're there and they're pushing. The question is not, will they push or not? It's, will we push to?
I have another question for you. Is solar power cost effective in the Puget Sound area and also at a personal level?
Yeah, so let me give a couple answers to that, because when we think of the leader in installed rooftop solar in the world, up until very recently, that's been Germany.
Mm-hmm.
And so think about what Germany has as far as their climate. In fact, Germany has, for most of the country, about 80% of the irradiation, meaning 80% of the sunlight of what we have here in Seattle. Now, if you go north to Snohomish, where my parents live, different ballgame because of the convergence zone. But here in Seattle, and in this part of the Puget Sound region, which does have some variance to it, yeah, if Germany has done it, there's no reason why we can't do it too. And I think as well, when you talk about cost, the solar panels I was talking about that are right above me, I had a relatively small, but what could fit my budget, a 5 kilowatt system that I had installed back in 2014. I've been loving the idea of living in a solar powered home since I was a kid, and I saw my first solar powered home in the neighborhood. So my cost to install that, if you don't mind me sharing, was $22,000 for that system. If I bought the exact same size of system now that would have better technology, that wouldn't have the big ugly inverters on my wall, but would have micro inverters up the panel so you never see them, would be just slightly more than half that. For the same system with better technology installed today, and the cost has basically dropped down to about 60% of that. That's the reality of what has happened in terms of the cost drop in electricity for installed PV. And where is it going to go over the next 10 years? It's going to drop further from there. So we have to understand that when we're looking at PV and whether it's cost effective, ultimately, if you're able to take that capital cost, which is shrinking, yes. Now, something that exists now that didn't exist 7 years ago is honestly programs where you're kind of leasing your roof in a lot of ways. If you have a roof that is a good candidate for it, as mine is, it's flat, I have minimal shading on it, then there are companies that will offer, I'd read the fine print carefully, a chance to install on your roof, and you get the benefit of having solar power in your house, but your cost is essentially negligible for the installation. They still own it, but you're helping solve the problem by putting more solar PV out there.
Great. I don't, unless anyone has any last minute questions, I think we have asked all the questions that were submitted, which is great. This is so great to have all this feedback and questions from the audience. So thank you for that. Let me just check one more time. Carla, we have answered all the questions. Randy, thank you. Thank you so much for a fantastic program.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks so much. I appreciate the opportunity to hear from everyone. I'm going to go answer my door here right now. I'll step away for a moment, but that's good timing. Thanks, everybody, and I'll be here in the background.
Thank you.